everyone, Ben Coomber Radio, episode number 333, I think. So, today, you are in for a treat. We go from one geeky brain to another. So, we had a Q&A show recently with me and Tom. Tom is very clever. In fact, Tom is far cleverer than me. And we have a even brighter brain on the podcast today. Someone that does stuff in the lab, researches, and which is awesome, discusses their research in the wider internet space, because sometimes researchers are so busy in their labs playing about with rats and white compounds and all that kind of stuff that they don't actually get out and get to discuss that enough with the wider population. And we know that research grounds the principles that we use in diet, fitness and exercise to get change in people. So luckily we have someone that loves sharing their stories today and the research that they're doing and the groundbreaking things that they're learning. Abbie Smith-Ryan, hello.
Hello, so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I should probably put doctor on the front of that.
You could, not needed.
To be honest, if I was a doctor, I'd be like, hello, yeah, doc. No, you missed it off the front. Hello.
Some people say it's the wrong kind of doctor, right? The PhD, not the end.
Sure. Abbie, let me give you the floor for a little bit. Give people a little bit of background into what you do, and I suppose why you're passionate about what it is that you do.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm a research geek, like you said. So I spend most of my time in the laboratory. So I run a lab, mostly looking at humans with diet and exercise. Body composition is a big piece of that. And then I also teach. So I work at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, in the US of A. And so, I'm really grounded in the research piece. But as you mentioned, this is the most fun to me is to, we can publish papers and write books. But really, I find some of what you do in the podcast and the speaking, that's where people really get to hear and use the research that we're doing in the lab. And that's kind of why I went into this field, to, how do I say it? Basically, we look at a lot of exercise approaches, nutrition approaches to improve health and body composition and overall fitness and feelings of well-being. And so if I can help someone feel a little better or, not be so worried about what they're eating or make small lifestyle changes and see results, that's what really gets me going and up out of bed.
With being a researcher, I can imagine you get quite frustrated about some of the things that are said on the internet, the things that people believe. Like if you were to sit in front of, male or female and start to talk about diet and nutrition, you can see there's so much confusion in some people when sometimes exercise and nutrition is really, really simple. What kind of advice do you give to people to almost develop a bit more common sense and a bit of a bullshit radar to navigate their own journey in identifying fact from fiction in what they see on the internet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, things have really blown up on the internet, and some of it's good because, it has people thinking, but so many of it and so much of it is misinformation. And so I almost think, not everybody has to be a scientist, but if you can, there's so many free available research resources now that even if you can't really understand it all, you can go and look. Like, for example, there's lots of free research articles like through the Journal of International Society of Sport Nutrition and like Class 1, JAP, or Journal of Applied Physiology. There's some general things that you can just go and get a general sense of what's out there. To be a little bit more educated. And the way I look at it is like your body, right? Your life, like take some investment in it, even if it takes a few more minutes, make a couple more clicks than just seeing, like your first Google search and kind of a general search. So I would just say, if you can be a little bit more aware and not take it from someone directly, but go look at some of the research resources, that's kind of the advice I would give. Or find someone trusted, like you yourself are putting out some good information. There's, Sigma Nutrition, some good resources that you can go to kind of get some more education behind that area.
So, one of the core topics of today is going to be the differences between male and females. It's something that you're passionate about now. And there's I think there's almost two extremes. There's some people that say, well, there's not really a lot of differences. We would train and eat in very, very similar ways. And there's almost really extremes. And I think this is probably kind of more of a marketing thing of some coaches saying that, you know, females should train totally different. They should eat totally differently. They should be on X macronutrient split. Talk me through, or where I suppose do you want to start with what you're thinking or the messages that you want to get out in the difference between men and women, and maybe we should start at maybe the exercise conversation first.
Yeah, and I think just a high-level view, it's just pretty interesting. So the National Institutes of Health funds a lot of research, obviously, and it was about 5 years ago that they basically said any researcher must either include women or justify why they're not including them, like for, you know, and so it just really shows the infancy of what we don't know. So I think that is where the value lies, and basically saying, particularly with exercise, the research really hasn't gone there yet. So we don't know if men and women really respond differently. We know a few things, right? Basically, like on the cellular level about how the muscle adapts, etc. But we don't know how, like on a translational level, how men and women adapt, or if they adapt differently. And so I think it really is interesting to me because there's such little data, yet we have, you know, thousands of years of recommendations for exercise, both aerobic and strength, but not a lot of data on how men and women differ. And if they do, and even age, right? Pre versus postmenopausal. I've had 2 babies in the last 2.5 years. What happens, you know, pre, during, post-pregnancy? There's just a lot that happens hormonally to a female that the males don't have to deal with.
Sure. So if you were to sit down and we didn't have any health conditions to look at, you know, we just talked about menopause, which might be a condition that we have to look at. If you had a male, a female, both 35 years old, both living a fairly healthy lifestyle, kind of have, you know, similar goals in that they want to be strong, fit, healthy, metabolically healthy, would your recommendation be different for both of those people to maximize their potential with looking at themselves from an everyday athlete point of view?
It's a great question. I think I would ask more questions. I would ask the individual, you know, what their training history was, particularly get a sense of kind of what their metabolic health and their mitochondria might look like. So, for example, you know, in the past, have they done more aerobic training? Have they done strength training? And then also, do they have a previous dieting history? That can have a big impact on how someone might respond to exercise. The more dieting, and that can be male or female, but the more dieting that they've done can impact their results. Yeah, and then the other thing I think you probably deal with in some of your listeners is just sometimes the messages to women are to not train like a male, not lift heavy, and, you know, progressive resistance training, which is where they should be doing. So in that sense, probably males and females would be the same with the intensity, but some of the nutritional or kind of the feeding statuses are different. Cycle history, we can get into some specifics, but I think it goes back to more individualized. What are some questions that you might ask or things you might explore about past exercise history and dieting history?
One of the things, if I was to give some kind of coaching experience here that I've kind of looked at is, obviously when we talk in the general population, we have to give some form of generalizations to enable someone to have something tangible to work with. And quite a while ago, I started to speak a lot about intermittent fasting and fasting in general and the sex differences, male and female. And as a general rule, at the time of me looking, it seemed to indicate that fasting seems to be pretty positive in men, hormonally, and a bit negative over time for females. And I was getting a lot of questions from females because obviously fasting was being highly talked about, and it was kind of like a thing, so people wanted to try it. And people were saying, well, why does the female hormonal system get negatively impacted? And I was like, well, the researchers aren't sure, and there's work that needs to be done. But if I was to look at coaching experience, as a whole, I find that females generally struggle with stress load a bit more, connected to how they feel emotionally day to day. And if we look at a training template that might be adding stress, and then a new dietary template that might be adding stress, because fasting is a form of stress that, don't get me wrong, will lead to some form of adaptation, but the body has to be in a place to handle that adaptation. Do you think it, talking about individuality, do you think it starts to come down to the overall stress load that the body can actually handle and adapt from? Because after all, if you can't adapt from a stress, then the stress is going to be damaging.
Yeah, I guess I think stress is definitely a big piece of it, right, as one stress hormone. But I think there's a lot of other hormones involved. So I think, and you guys may have talked about this already, but one really fascinating thing that happens with females during fasting is that there's almost this anxiolytic effect, whereas women feel like, and this is more in like the anorexia literature, but females actually feel like they have more energy and can actually go longer without eating, and they feel okay, whereas men typically don't adapt quite like that. So I think there's definitely a link to the brain emotional piece of things, like you mentioned. So stress is a piece, but there's more to it. The other piece too would be the physiological component of just the mitochondrial adaptations that can happen with fasting, and just the ability of and the adaptation of kind of fuel regulation per se. That's not necessarily directly related to stress, more of that physiological adaptation.
So I'm interested in kind of almost qualifying my current recommendations. Quite often when I speak to females, I actually had it at the weekend. Someone asked me about fasting and I said, I think it could be great if you feel that it could fit into your lifestyle and work for you. But you need to ensure that you're sleeping really well, you feel balanced, you kind of feel in control, and that stress is going to be something that is going to be positive for you. And do you think I'm framing my coaching in the right way to say, by all means, try fasting, but make sure you're in a really good place, because the research kind of indicates otherwise there might be a slow decline in some physiological markers?
Yeah, I would ask the individual to ask themselves, like, what's their motivation for doing it, right? I feel like fasting has a role in a couple areas. One, if they haven't ever done it before and they kind of see it as like they're not seeing changes, right? Sometimes it's nice to just show your body there's a different adaptation, right? But if they've, dieted in the past and under-eaten consistently, like, fasting is probably not a good approach for them, even if they're slept well, right? Another thing is to look really at life cycle. So, for example, if they're in a phase of life where they just can't eat as much, then maybe they look at that, but they really should, females especially, look at their exercise approach and not fast around exercise. So really true intermittent fasting is not necessarily the best approach for females, based on how fat adapts and we utilize fat and some of those adaptations and like you mentioned, some of the stress hormones. The other thing, it wouldn't be truly intermittent fasting, but is to try it like once every couple weeks, as more of just a kind of switch things up. But I would probably not recommend it long term for most people.
Okay.
Most females too.
Interesting. Okay. So that was kind of the exercise side of things. In terms of nutritional, moving away from fasting, do you see there any difference in recommendations between men and women? I know a conversation in fitness is always macronutrients. People are like, give me the perfect macronutrient split. Do you see there a kind of a fuel utilization preference between male and female?
I do, particularly. So we've done some interesting stuff to kind of answer some of these mainstream myths, I guess. It's one fun part of having a lab, right? You can answer your own questions. And we looked at, particularly to not all, but women are notorious for like, oh, I'm going to have a banana before I exercise, right? Versus like, men, I'm going to have a protein shake or something like that. Or fast in general. Females are notorious for not eating before they exercise. And some of the data we found, which matches up with some other long-term data, is that a bolus of protein, particularly about 90 calories, so like a protein shake versus carbohydrate, is better at increasing energy expenditure and fat oxidation in women. And there's a lot of data too that shows that just fat oxidation or fat use is elevated by eating something before you exercise, or for a female exercises versus a male. So it just goes to show you that what kind of even I've changed over the years is definitely have something before you exercise. And it doesn't have to be a lot, but it should be mostly proteins or amino acids versus a carbohydrate.
Interesting. So why do you think that is? Because obviously we can look at carbohydrate and say, well, that's a fuel source that's going to be digested quicker. So what's at play?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, if like you're going to go run a marathon, don't just have proteins, but it should still be a fairly high load of protein. And it really comes down to, I believe, and some of the science shows, is that in general, we all eat so many carbohydrates, and so that's what our body is used to using. And so if I feed or if I eat carbohydrate right before I exercise, I'm not going to tap into my fat stores. I'm going to use that glucose that's available, particularly if I'm just doing like a HIIT session or a resistance training session. I'm not going to, really use a ton of glycogen. I'll just use what's available. And so by providing amino acids, they're not like the most energy efficient. So then basically you use some amino acids, you will use some glucose, but then you'll tap into your fat stores and get into some of that beta oxidation.
Okay. So piecing another part of that conversation together, actually burning more fat in and around an exercise session, or in an exercise session, in theory and in most people's common sense, sounds good, because I exercise, I want to burn fat. But when we bring that into the wider calorie distribution across the course of a day, if that doesn't alter someone's overall burn or change anything across the course of the day, are we talking about detail that to most people won't actually have any tangible effect?
That's a great question. So the other piece that I should tell you is that when we looked at the protein intake versus carbohydrate, and there's some other labs that have looked at this in some different ways, but it also increases energy expenditure. So now there is still some thought, well, does it lead to fat loss? I think there's still some questions there, but ultimately, if you're able to burn some additional fat, but also burn more calories, that would essentially probably get to your goal quicker. Obviously, we need more data, but the way I look at it is like, why wouldn't you? What's the negative side effect, right? Opposed to basically ensuring that you're eating something and switching up the type of food that you eat before you exercise.
Sure. Interesting. Okay, so I never want to leave the audience confused on this show. So
sure.
We earlier kind of talked about individualization and listening to your body. So would your recommendation be to, let's say, take a week's training of someone and say, right, Monday, try having like a banana before you train. And then Tuesday, try having a protein bar or a protein shake, or something that isn't too high calorie. And then the next day, maybe mix that load. And then maybe the fourth day, try a protein and fat-based snack. And literally just see how you respond. Try and train in a similar way. Try and feel that you've had like a similar night's sleep, so there's no kind of problem there with kind of energy. And literally just see how you respond. Because looking at the research, I find that I would be quite favourable to that. I'd quite enjoy a protein-based snack. But I know that some people wouldn't be like that and they would respond. So I'm just trying to clarify what you would tend to recommend.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's why I like doing this, right? Give it a kind of different view set, taking from the lab to practical. I would almost say give it more than one day. Do it a couple days, because usually you can get through one workout and be fine, right? But give it a couple days where maybe you do the protein-based snack prior to for a couple days, have a rest day, then do that carbohydrate protein mix snack a couple days, and just kind of see. The interesting thing, which I'm sure you're aware of too, is that most often it takes the body a couple weeks to adapt to kind of a new fuel utilization, right? More dramatic changes takes about 2 weeks. But so I don't know if anyone would feel a big difference 1 or 2 days, but maybe that's a good thing. But overall, it would be more, things that I always look at is, how do you feel? What's your energy like during? How do you feel after? What's your soreness like? We just finished a study looking at some nutrient timing in women in a progressive resistance training study, looking at pre versus post, some of those things. And so sometimes it's that longer view of how things kind of line up and whether you should abandon that approach or not.
Okay. I want to add a final bit of context here because when I train, for example, I usually train at like 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon. And the chances are I've eaten like just a normal mixed meal like 2 hours before training. Obviously, my thought process isn't to go, oh, I need a snack because I've eaten 2 hours ago. There's plenty kicking about. In this situation, is this kind of like you haven't eaten for a while, or maybe you're getting up and you've got an empty stomach and we're just recommending a small type of calorie load to enhance training? Is this the context?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. So yeah, in that scenario, like if you're eating regularly and you're not really, worried about caloric intake, then yeah. But if it's a matter of like you're trying to, let's say it's in a dieting phase where you're really conscious about your calories, then I would maybe prioritize that snack ahead of time. Or like you mentioned, if you're actually getting a solid meal, which most people don't at lunch, right, or before they train a couple hours, then it's not that big of a deal. If you're getting a bolus of carbohydrate, protein, and fat, that's going to still be in your system. But if you're like, maybe the UK is not like this, but if you're like most Americans, right, you have a shitty lunch or nothing at all, and then you go train, or you wake up in the morning and you haven't had a great meal, then I would really prioritize having some of those amino acids up front.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So there was another topic I wanted to cover today, and it kind of ties into this stress load and individualization, because I know you are a massive fan about talking HIIT training, high intensity interval training. Firstly, I'd love if you could clarify what the research defines as high intensity training, because I think the general public think that anything that is hard and sweaty is HIIT training, whether it's boxercise, boot camp, like it's all HIIT training. Is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will say the nice thing about HIIT training is it doesn't have to be like super scientific, but really the premise lies in the ability to elevate your heart rate for a short period of time that you could not sustain. So generally it should be over a minute. So like boot camp is not going to get you there, right? So a minute of hard work at least, and then let's say a minute of rest would be one example. And that minute of hard work you shouldn't be able to hold it for like a minute and 20. It should be pretty darn hard. That being said, it can be different modes. Like it doesn't have to be on a treadmill, right? You can do it different modes of exercise, but there's a lot of types of people think it like a boot camp, or the other thing is short or SIT, basically our sprint interval training would be more like 30 seconds all out. I don't know if anybody's ever done a Wingate. Basically 30 seconds makes you want to throw up, and then do those repeatedly. Like most people aren't doing that, right? Like it should be hard and you should want to stop, and then you have to do it all over again multiple times. That's HIIT.
Okay, interesting. So actually, I would say my definition of communicating that is potentially wrong, because my kind of interpretation was that you would be wanting to go all out in a fashion that really most people aren't going to be able to sustain for longer than like 15, 20 seconds. And my understanding came from, I think it was either the work of Lane Norton or Dr. Jacob Wilson, where they were talking about the bike tests, and they were doing 15 seconds on and then like 3 minutes rest. And really, there's a big decline in performance after like 5 repeated bouts. So in theory, that's what we're looking at for true high intensity training, where the body is just literally flat out max power.
Yeah, so it's actually 30 seconds, so that's more like repeated Wingates, which there's definitely a place for that, and a lot of the foundational work happened from Martin Gabala's lab, some really, really interesting stuff. But to be honest, for that to actually work, and if you look at the literature, you have to have, you don't have to have specialized equipment, but basically the load is at a percentage of your body weight, so like 6.5% of your body weight. So that's really hard to mimic on like a stationary bike or like equipment that you don't have in a lab. And it's also really hard to do for people that are maybe not as fit. Like as fit people, we're kind of glutton for punishment, right? Like we kind of know. And so a lot of my work has been able to do kind of a 1 minute protocol. I mean, really you can do it. Anybody can do a minute for, you can hang on to a minute. So it's not as intense all out, but that minute is very intense. And that's something that's easy for someone to go into the gym and do on their own and have it really be effective. So that 30-second repeated with minute, 3 to 5 minutes in between, it works. But who in the hell has time to do that, right? If you think about 5 times you do that with like 15 minutes of rest, it doesn't really save you time. One of the premises of HIIT is that you can do it and it's quick and it's very effective.
Yeah, I love your definition, because I think in the health and fitness landscape, we need quite broad terms, because people's interpretations, I suppose specificity sometimes doesn't allow for flexibility. And when you look at someone's training regime and they go into a new gym or there's something different, and they're like, oh, I'm meant to be doing, this exact time period of this. And it's like, no, just kind of pick a minute-ish time window, go for it, have a short rest, then go for it again. And I think in the grand scheme of things, with most people just trying to keep fit, that is very sensible advice.
Well, yeah, and I think the other nice thing is that, we all go through life cycles where we're more fit or less fit, and that's an easy, adaptable way where you can still kick your ass, but it can be at a different relative intensity, right?
Sure. Do you think there needs to be a bit of caution paid to the implementation of HIIT training? Because, well, in some respects, it could be quite stressful to the body. Like, obviously, depending on the length of time you're going to do it for. But, I know some people that are, really going at it. And I remember I would class it as HIIT training. The last spin class I went to, Christ, I felt like not getting out of bed for 2 days. It was really hard work. I think sometimes there needs to be this, it's good, but just be careful with the dose.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. So one, people are like, oh, I do HIIT every day. And I was like, well, one, if you're doing HIIT every day, I wouldn't advise that. And you're probably not doing it right if you can really try and do it every day, right? The problem, though, too, is that it doesn't take very long. So, I was a distance runner in college. And so I, felt like if I didn't physically could not pick myself up off the ground, my workout wasn't good enough, right? And then looking at some of the HIIT literature, like when you finish, you feel awful, but usually you don't feel quite like you did if I ran 10 miles, right? It's a different sense. And so a lot of times people have this false sense like, oh, I didn't do very much volume, I'm going to go do HIIT again. And so, yeah, they end up under-recovering for sure. And, that the whole hormonal component can be an issue. But with HIIT, too, I would say, really, you wouldn't want to do more than a couple times a week. There'd be no purpose. The adaptations that we see you can get from a couple times a week.
Nice. Okay. So to finish the conversation on sex differences with nutrition and exercise, supplementation talked about all the time, always. It's always on people's minds. I commonly get asked by females, like, is creatine okay? Is it going to turn me into the Incredible Hulk and stuff? Does there tend to be a difference in your supplement advice to men and women, or is it pretty similar?
No, I actually maybe should have said this before we began. This is something that is near and dear to my heart because, one, most people have no idea what supplements they should be taking, and those poor females really have no idea, right? And so let me just preface this by saying we just finished, I partnered with some genetics colleagues, and we just published a paper looking at some sex-based differences in a mouse model, looking at some HIIT with the idea that we'll add a nutrition piece. And I'll just say in general, to summarize that piece, is that the HIIT, for example, we have sometimes women that don't respond to exercise, or they gain fat with exercise. And we know that HIIT will basically prevent all those negative aspects. And so most people will respond, which I think is a good thing. And then adding like the nutrition piece, the supplement piece, you bring up creatine. And I think, honestly, that would be the one supplement that I would tell, well, there'll be plenty, but the first one on my list that I would tell almost every female to consume, no matter what life cycle. And particularly because we have creatine stores in our brain along with our muscle. And because this is a stated fact, I'm not, because of the emotional nature of females, our brain chemistry is different. There's some really fascinating data that creatine can help prevent depression, can help prevent postpartum depression, and also have almost like a stimulant effect, and that'd be both in males and females. But creatine is one of those things that I think every female should take.
Oh, interesting. I personally always generally recommend with the kind of the training that most people do that it goes alongside beta-alanine. A fan?
Yeah. So the thing about beta-alanine, and I've done a lot of work on beta-alanine. I haven't in the recent years, but beta-alanine is one of those things that if you're training consistently, I think the research shows that it could be helpful. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, there's some mechanisms, like I think it could be helpful for other ways. We just haven't tapped into the mechanisms yet, so I don't recommend it all the time. But for example, like I had a baby and postpartum I didn't take it, but then when I was ready to kind of increase my volume, I would take it.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's not one of those things, like you have to be pretty diligent about consumption. Mm-hmm. And the benefits, I would say if you're feeling fatigued or you have really high volume, then maybe it would be beneficial.
Nice. Okay, interesting. I know we talked about creatine or creatine as as you guys across the pond would say. Is there any other areas that you want to highlight for differences between male and female? Because I know we went off on a tangent there.
Yeah, I would say probiotics.
Okay.
So most people, I know I saw some of your background on your history of IBS and all that stuff. The data on probiotics to me is just so fascinating, and a lot of people don't realize that the research is strain specific. So if you have a cup of yogurt, there's probiotics in there, but that's a specific type of yogurt, and it's not really as beneficial as, let's say, a strain specific or women specific probiotic. And I say that just because there's some really interesting data on specific probiotics for, let's say, IBS or depression or performance or immune function. So knowing, doing a little bit of your homework on what strains you're consuming is really helpful. And, I would say that in general for males too, but there's a little bit more data on just the gut-brain axis. And so probiotics to me are really fascinating.
Yeah, I got into it heavily when I was younger, and I don't suffer with IBS anymore. And the research always seemed to just say, like, the best thing we can say now is grab a probiotic shotgun and get plenty of strains in there, because it's starting to become difficult, and do the research at the pace that people want the information to actually really know what strain is going to help you. So if you can find a probiotic that has 5, 6, 7 strains at a high level, 20, 30, 50 billion, do that.
Yeah, and the other thing I would note too is, like, if there's certain, like, if you're struggling with like a certain component, there are certain strains that I would look for. So, like, this is maybe not directly related, but like with my babies, I give them a specific strain that is related to, like, gas and colic that there's research on, and immune function, instead of just giving them the whole gamut, right? Because you also don't want to repopulate if not necessary, if your diet's okay. So in, like, adults, the biggest thing that I would look for is, one, making sure that it's stable. So some of the ones that you buy, on the shelf have been there too long and aren't going to be that, powerful. And then I would just look like, there are ones that are specifically made for women versus men. And I would just look to see, you know, what are the key differences. And some of those female-specific strains are going to have things that are more helpful to our physiology than, say, yours. Now, it wouldn't be detrimental, but it just maybe works a little bit faster or more targeted.
So with that conversation in mind, do you find that most people benefit from a probiotic?
I think they do, but most people don't stick with it. The thing about probiotics is that it's almost like, I mean, obviously I'm a big believer that you have to clean up your diet first, right? Like the healthy fruits and vegetables are going to repopulate your flora, but you need to have it almost every day, a probiotic, because if not, then your bacteria changes innately. And so I think if you stick with it, it's one of those things that it does have an overall helpful factor, but it's not just like a one-day fix.
I think
with most supplements, right?
Yeah, of course. I think some of the most interesting research I've enjoyed is its effect on helping athletes kind of prevent from illness and just getting run down. I think that's interesting, especially in our demographic where people are kind of training like athletes a lot of the time. We're training hard.
Yeah, and but not sleeping, overworking, not eating. Yeah.
100%.
Agree.
Well, Abbie, I've really enjoyed today's conversation. Thank you very much. I'd love for people to be able to find a bit more about some of your information online, some of the blogs and the videos you've done. So if you can point people to those places now, that would be awesome. And obviously we'll link it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I'm really bad at that piece of my life. Maybe moving forward. I try and post some stuff on Twitter. And then, honestly, all my science is just on PubMed. But, you know, the UNC website is my bio, and I'm always happy to, you know, respond via email. And then I give talks all around, so I'll be at NSCA in a couple months, I guess next month. So, and the internet, so maybe one day I'll have a website.
Well, what I will say to people is if they type your name into Google, pretty much the first 10 searches that I found this morning were like YouTube lectures that you've done. I saw a great article on Girls Gone Strong? So if they just type your name into Google, they'll find your stuff and they'll find you on Twitter as well.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I have. We could talk a lot more. So I have a lot of more information to get. Maybe I'll get some tips from you, Ben, on how to be a more social media presence.
But don't neglect the research. That's what you love doing.
I was going to say that's where all my time is spent. That and mentoring new researchers. So
exactly, you can't do everything, but you are doing a very good job. So don't stop.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and thanks for having me. This is always fun.
Been a pleasure. Right, everyone, wave goodbye to Abbie wherever you are. If you're in a car, do it. It'll look funny. Some people in a bus will look at you and giggle. Abbie, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a fascinating research geeky chat. For people that enjoyed this and want to expand the conversation, feel free to reach out and say something on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. Please, if you've liked what Abbie has said, go and have a little look around. Go and look at some articles. Reach out to her. She is available just like I am. If you are new to this show, I hope you enjoyed it. There's plenty of other episodes. If you enjoyed it and you would like to support it, just leave a review on iTunes. That's all I ask. It helps the show grow. And if you think, do you know what? I know someone that would love to listen to this podcast, tag them into the post, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, that's it from me. I will see you on Monday's micro show, and then I'll be with another awesome guest, maybe even me and Tom geeking out on Thursday. Anyway, have an awesome day. You know where to find me, Ben Coomber. Goodbye.